And it's funny because this is also part of my other life now coming here, so it feels interesting. I was talking to my cousin, who's a very big part of my life in America, and I was telling him I was having a launch party, and he said, you know, he was remembering my last party that I had that was at this nightclub, you know, and all this stuff, and he said, oh, I remember you had that vodka sponsor, it was so awesome, and I said, well, there's not going to be any vodka sponsor.
But two is new.
Two is new, yeah. And you know, life has changed, obviously. I'm not a New York City novelist that's getting called Carrie Bradshaw, ever anymore. It used to happen probably every day. And I also am not really worrying more than anything whether my hair is frizzing. I'm actually quite all right with the fact that it is. So, books. Right? Okay. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about sort of the behind the scenes of the writing, because to me, when I hear authors talk, I think that's the most interesting thing to me. I want to think, well, how did you come up with this? And, you know, how did it work and what was the process and all of that? So, to me, I think one of the most interesting things about fiction is the way that all these different sort of topics come together to create the story. And sometimes what happens is it's so vivid to the reader that in the future, if you hear anything about one of those topics, you almost always think about that book and you think about those things together. And normally, you wouldn't think of those things together. They're totally different. So, like some of the things that I've mixed in my career, it sounds crazy when you read the list here, but they actually did just come out organically. I've mixed New York nightlife with survivor guilt, which was an interesting mix. I think nobody could have probably done that except for me. I mixed in another book Brooklyn and relationships with grandma, special grandma love, with mysticism. So that's probably a combo that couldn't have happened if you didn't have the route that I had. And then another one was about a fear of driving a car and commitment issues. So all of those things somehow came together to create books that actually people have told me they liked. So I think that's really interesting. So I want to tell you a little bit about how that works for a writer, how they come together to those things. So. When you are doing it, and those connections sort of come together in these sublime moments when it feels like, oh, I've got it. I've actually got something. That to me feels like, when it happens, it feels like it's unwrapped rather than, you know, you just created it, as if the story was always there and just waiting for you to discover it. It feels almost fated, you know? It's a sort of a magic thing that happens. And for me, putting these different pieces together to get that sort of high feeling is exactly the addiction that makes me keep coming back for more and more. And so, you know, you see that blank page and you say, oh, well, I want to come back because I want to have that feeling again and again. And to me, that's what writing is all about. Ariel, you? Yeah. And we're not alone, because writers always report this feeling of ecstasy. It's actually really interesting to read other writers talking about it. And, you know, people say when the muse comes to visit, people actually talk about it in very similar ways. So they have the same kind of feeling. And I think the Australian author Sue Wolf puts it really well. She says, I find myself continually, compulsively courting my mind to make up stories. And that means courting the fear, anxiety, and shame that seem to come with wrestling with creativity for the sake of its occasional triumphs, and for the few moments that these triumphs become bliss, a private bliss that for a short time transfigures my world. And that to me is exactly what happens. And she says, considering that the times that actually does happen are so few and far between, she says it can often seem like a pact with the devil. And I think that that's true when you are at a time when it's not working at all. Which actually did happen with this book for a long time. When Rod remembers, it was actually called something else before, and maybe I'll talk to you about it later. But anyway, there are actually lots of studies about the way artists' brains conduct this process to get to that kind of sweet spot. But it mainly comes down to this, which is this initial phase in which you put aside all sense of control. And we call it in the industry pantsing, like you're flying by the seat of your pants. So you don't have a plan and you're just sort of going with it. And Wolf says of that one, it's a process of chaos and uncertainty. And that's definitely true, but to me it feels normal because I do that all the time. But the amazing bit is this, not only does it come together in moments that even Proust says is like a mental state akin to trance or reverie, but in the end, the outcome seems orderly, right? So it's kind of crazy how it all comes together like that. So there are parts of your brain working that you don't even know are working. And there are people that make careers of combing through books to find out what the writer's intention was, you know? So people want to do that, so it almost as if they feel, they must have had a plan, and they must have known what they were doing. And me, when I was in university, I always riffed very creatively in my assignments when I was supposed to be doing that. And academia didn't really like that very often. And I think back now, and I think, well, that's kind of funny, because I did want to be a professor, and I can see why I wound up sort of taking this route to creating instead. And artists themselves are bewildered. We have no idea how it works, and we are always thinking about it and dissecting how it happens and trying to obsessively listen to how other people do it and if we're like them. And I think in the beginning you don't think very much about how it works, and you probably don't understand it at all. And then when you start hearing other people talk about it, then you can come back and say, oh, yes, that's what happens with me. That's a really good way to put it. But actually, there have been some scientific studies on it recently, and this is sort of neurobiology stuff. And it seems to say that in all the studies that they did, that sort of disinterested, chaotic creation is actually necessary to create books and to be creative in that way and to make things fall so beautifully into that theme. And so you sort of have to be crazy and all unorganized in order to jump me this book by Stephen King that's called On Writing. And in it he says, plot is, I think, the good writer's last resort and the dullard's first choice. It's very messy, it's intuitive, it's enchanted, and the path is very extraordinary. And how I got to this particular book, especially so, and after I have maybe a couple more of these, if you pull me over, maybe I will tell you a little bit.